Joining us now from Beijing, Qinduo Xu is a political analyst for China Radio International. From Berlin, Matteo Garavoglia is a non-resident fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. From London, Alexander Nekrassov is a former advisor to the Russian government. And with us in the studio, John Sitilides is a global risk analyst and U.S. government affairs consultant. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Qinduo, let me start with you, and let's take a step back and look at the G20 that took place last year in China, in Hangzhou. How did that summit set the stage for what we've just witnessed in Hamburg, Germany?
Well, one difference is like, when it was held in Hangzhou, it's a clean event, with it was held like smoothly with, let's say, little protest. But in Hamburg, a lot of people, we seen demonstrators against capitalism. But the theme remains similar. That is globalization and free trade, innovation, development, inclusive development. I see there's a continuation of the themes mentioned in Hangzhou. I think that's good. You see the world major powers are working together on those most important issues facing the world. So hopefully that will be constructive, despite the differences, on climate change and the rise of protectionism, in particular, late last year and early this year.
Matteo, Germany was the host this year at the G Summit. How will Germany be looking at it? What's the balance sheet look like? Will Germany be pleased with the outcome?
I think Germany made a very good job out of a terrible situation it found itself dealing with. We had a number of things that were difficult to handle. A, we knew there were a number of protesters coming to Hamburg from all over Europe. B, we knew that the United States and President Donald Trump would have had a rather challenging take on a number of issues that had to be discussed. And C, there was a whole lineup of new leaders coming to this G20 with different backgrounds and different domestic political situations to deal with. And we should look at that. But Germany overall, I think, did a good job in keeping things together, so to speak.
Alexander, one of the big, highly anticipated meetings at this G20 summit took place actually on the sidelines of the summit, and that was the meeting between President Trump and President Putin. How important was that meeting?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that the G20 summits are actually more interesting about the one-on-one meetings on the sidelines rather than the sessions. And I think that this particular G20 summit was completely different from all the others, simply because America suddenly became a totally different player in the game. So to say that it's, it's similar to the previous ones, I don't see any similarity at all. Now, I think that the meeting between Putin and Trump was, on the one hand, a good meeting because they sort of, they were friendly with each other, there was sort of a chemistry there. But unfortunately, I don't think this meeting produced anything on a big scale. I mean, this so-called ceasefire in Syria, I don't know whether it will last at all. I don't really think that these sides have become closer on any of the serious issues they were discussing. And already after the summit, that meeting, we can see that President Trump suddenly decided not to do this joint team on cybersecurity, which was decided at the meeting between Putin and Trump. And suddenly he said, no way, I'm not going to do this. So, to be honest with you, I think it was good in the sense that they didn't walk out on each other or started screaming at each other. But on balance, I don't see any huge results from it.
John, this was President Trump's first G20 summit. What is your assessment of his performance there?
Well, to Alexandra's point, and it's a very interesting one, we begin with the premise that Donald Trump is not a politician. And I think 6 months into his presidency, we still forget that. And the European leaders and other world leaders at G20 who haven't met Mr. Trump yet had a sense of what it is to bring somebody from outside the political orbit into the world of domestic and, in this case, international politics. So a very different type of leader representing a very different type of an American agenda. But he came in, I think, with two larger goals. One, a very pro-energy agenda and a very pro-security agenda. That may not be what many of the G20 leaders were seeking, but Donald Trump is determined to carve out what his agenda is going to be and to move other world leaders in his direction over time.
When you say he comes in as someone who is not a politician, what does that mean?
It means exactly that. Most of the other leaders at the G20 have come in through the ranks. Most of them in their entire adult lives have seasoned themselves, groomed themselves to run for higher office or to become leaders of particular parties or whatnot. Donald Trump has never had this as part of his lifelong pursuit, at least not until recent years. He's been thrust onto a global stage in a way that no one would have predicted, at least most of us who are honest, 2 years ago, let alone back in November. It's a very different type of American leadership. We're still getting accustomed to it here in Washington and across the United States. And now our counterparts, friends and foes, are having no choice but to get accustomed to this leadership as well.
Qinduo, if we look at some of the economic goals of the G20 summit, if we go back again to that 11th G20 summit in Hangzhou last September, one of the goals of the Chinese presidency at that time, and I'm quoting here, was support for an interconnected, invigorated and inclusive world economy. Do you believe that those ideals have been successfully carried to the Hamburg summit?
Well, despite all the differences, as I said, on climate change and also on trade issue, we basically see there is a general consensus that is to continue to push for the globalization and the free trade. So in this sense, of course, I remember what happened just a month ago, actually in May, the summit of this Belt and Road Initiative. You see, the initiative itself stresses very much about the connectivity, infrastructure connectivity, and of course, policy connectivity and people-to-people connectivity. It's infrastructure. More than 100 countries and international organizations sent delegation to Beijing for that summit. So obviously, from China's point of view, yes, there's a continuation to push for globalization and for connectivity there.
Matteo, let's talk climate change. That was another important subject at this year's summit. Of course, China has been one of the prime movers behind the efforts to combat climate change. The United States has, in fact, pulled out of the Paris Accord. Let's take a listen to how Chancellor Merkel responded to the United States withdrawal. Let's watch.
You are familiar with the American position. You know that, unfortunately, and I deplore this, the United States of America left the climate agreement, or rather said, announced their intention of doing this. So what becomes clear in this declaration is the dissenting view of the United States, but I am very gratified to note that the other 19 member states of G20 say that the Paris Agreement is irreversible.
So, Matteo, as we heard there, on the issue of climate change, the G20 effectively became the G19. What is the significance of this and the fact that Chancellor Merkel effectively said, look, this is going to go ahead with or without the United States?
Put it simply, this is a policy area where the United States is isolated and the world is moving forward beyond and without the United States. This is part of a broader trend, however, which goes beyond climate change and has to do also with trade. What we've seen is, over the last few months, we've seen Europe and China, Germany and China, Europe and China, and moving forward in a number of policy areas. On climate change, you might recall the day after Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, both Europeans and the Chinese authorities issued a statement saying, well, we stick to it and we go ahead. Now with the G20, all 18 countries plus the European Union, so all countries minus the United States, have claimed that the Paris Agreement is irreversible, and they are sticking to that. So there we have a long-term, I think we're at the beginning of a medium to long-term trend where the world moves on beyond the United States. This is something, however, that we see in other policy areas. We see that also when it comes to trade. Interestingly, the day before the G20 started, the Europeans and the Japanese announced effectively a political deal to close a deal when it comes to free trade between Europe and Japan. This accounts for over 20% of world GDP and almost 40% of world trade. The day after the G20, the Europeans also announced that the 21st of September, the Canada-EU free trade deal will come into force. These are all signals that the Europeans are sending out loud and clear to say, well, on certain policy areas, we'll move on.
John, you want to say something?
I do. In addition to injecting uncertainty and unpredictability into domestic and now international politics, I will give Donald Trump credit for also injecting a level of honesty that most of these world leaders have really discarded from much of their public discourse.
Which is perhaps why you said he's not a politician.
Well, you look at Chancellor Merkel. They talk about a more globalized international economy. But the European Union has been revealed over the last decade to be structured in a way where Germany benefits very much at the expense of the southern tier of the European Union, and it has no intention of changing EU monetary or fiscal policies in any way that would eliminate those trade imbalances. And China, as we know, pursuing a very ambitious One Belt, One Road initiative around the world, has its economy in many ways closed off to foreign investment in China without adherence to very particular nationalist regulations and guidelines.
Yeah. Very quickly, John, before we take a break, on the issue of climate change, is the United States isolated now?
Again, it's a matter of honesty, I would say, more than anything else. The Trump administration recognizes that in 2016, U.S. carbon emissions were the lowest since 1992, largely because natural gas is replacing coal, because of teleworking and whatnot. In Germany, carbon emissions went up last year. They're using lignite now when they eliminated the use of nuclear power. So Germany needs to actually lower its carbon emissions rather than castigate other countries about not adhering to an agreement that they have no intention of abiding by themselves.
Right, that is another discussion, but we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, more with our panel on the G20 summit. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.